an in-depth investigative documentary into the bizarre 1909 discovery of a massive underground citadel hidden deep within the Grand Canyon. Discovered by explorer G.E. Kincaid and allegedly funded by the Smithsonian Institution, this ancient subterranean city held artifacts pointing to an unknown, highly advanced civilization. Why did the story completely vanish from official archives? Why is the specific area designated as a strict exclusion zone completely off-limits to the public today? We pieced together declassified logs, geological anomalies, and ancient tribal traditions to uncover the truth of what lies beneath the canyon floor. There is something beneath the Grand Canyon that the official maps do not show. Not in the records held by the National Park Service. Not in the geological surveys filed with the United States Geological Survey. Not in the archaeological reports submitted to the Smithsonian Institution. The most powerful cultural archive on the continent. The institution whose entire purpose is to document, preserve, and make accessible the material record of human civilization on this soil. It is not there, and yet, on April 5, 1909, the front page of the Arizona Gazette, a daily newspaper serving Phoenix, Arizona, then a city of roughly 11,000 people on the edge of what most Americans still thought of as the frontier, carried a headline that should have changed everything, should have altered the course of American archaeology, should have redefined the timeline of human civilization in the Western Hemisphere, should have sent teams of researchers scrambling to the canyon's rim with whatever equipment they could carry. Instead, it vanished. Not gradually, not through the slow erosion that time imposes on most historical events. It vanished the way things vanish when institutions decide they would prefer they had not happened. Quickly, completely, without explanation, without the kind of follow-up coverage that even a moderately significant discovery would normally generate, without a single official response from the Smithsonian, the very institution named as the expedition's sponsor, without an acknowledgement from the explorer whose name was printed beneath the headline, without a record, searchable or otherwise, in any archive that a member of the public can freely access today. This documentary is not about what was found beneath the Grand Canyon. We do not know with certainty what was found. That is precisely the point. This documentary is about the specific and revealing shape of what is missing, about the gap where a discovery should be, about the institutional silence that has replaced a story that, if true, represents one of the most significant archaeological finds in the history of the human species, about what that silence means, what it has cost, and what, after more than a century of enforced forgetting, may still be recoverable. The tunnels, if they exist, are still there. The evidence that something happened is still there. The question is whether the institutions and the individuals with the capacity to investigate it will find the will to do so before the darkness underground consumes the last of what they left behind. We begin, as all serious historical investigations must begin, at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as the available evidence allows. We begin with a newspaper, the April 5, 1909 report, breaking down the text that disappeared. The Arizona Gazette was not a tabloid. It was not a publication known for sensationalism or fabrication. It was a working regional newspaper in a territory that would not achieve statehood for another 3 years. A paper whose readership consisted primarily of ranchers, miners, small business people, and the various professionals who served them. Its editorial standards were, by the conventions of the era, reasonably sound. The story that ran on April 5, 1909, occupied a substantial portion of the front page and continued onto an interior page. It was bylined to a staff writer. It described, in considerable detail, the discovery of an enormous underground complex within the Grand Canyon by an explorer named G.E. Kincaid, described in the article as an experienced prospector and explorer. The article stated that the Smithsonian Institution was involved in funding the expedition, and that a Professor S.A. Jordan had been sent to the site to lead an archaeological investigation. The detail is important. The article is not vague. It does not gesture broadly at mystery. It gives specific measurements, specific compass bearings, specific descriptions of artifacts and architectural features. It names names. It identifies institutional affiliations. It describes a physical site with enough geographical precision that, if the account is accurate, the location could theoretically be verified. The central claims of the article are as follows. G.E. Kincaid, while rafting down the Colorado River, spotted an entrance to a cave or tunnel system approximately 2,000 feet above the river's current level. The entrance was notable enough that Kincaid returned to it, climbed to it, and explored it. What he found inside was not a natural cave system. What he found, according to the article's account of his testimony, was an engineered space of extraordinary scale. A main corridor or central hall, extending deep into the rock, radiating into side passages and chambers. Walls that bore evidence of deliberate shaping. A floor that had been leveled to a degree inconsistent with natural geological processes. Rooms containing artifacts, weapons, tools, tablets, urns, and in one chamber, a large seated figure that Kincaid described in terms suggesting it was a statue of a deity or revered personage. Mummies wrapped in an unfamiliar manner. Hieroglyphic writing on the walls, described not as Native American pictographs, but as something more formally structured, more systematically organized. The article goes further. It describes an apparent ventilation system built into the complex. Evidence of engineering foresight that would have required considerable technical knowledge. It describes the layout of the complex as suggesting a planned community rather than a naturally occurring shelter, and it describes the artifacts as pointing, in Kincaid's estimation, and apparently in the estimation of the Smithsonian researchers, who subsequently examined them, toward connections with civilizations of the ancient Near East or Asianta, not toward anything in the conventional archaeological record of pre-Columbian North America. This is the story. This is what the Arizona Gazette printed on April 5, 1909. And then there is nothing. No follow-up coverage in the Gazette or in any other regional or national publication. No statement from the Smithsonian confirming or denying the expedition. No record of a G.E. Kincaid in the Smithsonian's published employment directories or expedition logs for that period. No record of a Professor S.A. Jordan in the institutional histories of the period. No subsequent archaeological report on the site. No notation in the geographical surveys conducted by federal agencies in the Grand Canyon region in the years immediately following 1909. The absence is total. And that totality of absence is itself a kind of evidence, not proof of a cover-up. The word cover-up carries implications of coordinated, deliberate suppression that may or may not be warranted here. But evidence, certainly, of a structural failure, a failure of follow-through, a failure of institutional accountability, a failure that, given the magnitude of the claims involved, requires an explanation more substantive than the one most official sources have so far offered. That explanation, when it comes, is always the same. Newspaper hoax, G.E. Kincaid's expedition. The geometry of the unmappable entrance. Before we can evaluate the claim of hoax, and we will evaluate it carefully, because intellectual honesty requires us to take the debunking argument as seriously as we take the discovery claim. We need to understand exactly what G.E. Kincaid reported finding and why the specific geographical details he provided are as significant as the artifacts he described. The Colorado River at the floor of the Grand Canyon runs at an elevation of approximately 2,480 feet above sea level. The canyon's rim, depending on which rim and which point along its 277-mile length, ranges from roughly 6,800 to over 8,000 feet. Kincaid's reported entrance was located approximately 2,000 feet above the river's surface. Places is it in the section of canyon he was traveling, somewhere on the steep canyon walls, not at the rim, and not at river level, but in the intermediate zone that constitutes the canyon's characteristic layered walls of sedimentary rock. That zone is, under current regulations, entirely inaccessible to the general public. This is not, on its face, unusual. The Grand Canyon's canyon walls are inaccessible in most places simply because they are vertical cliffs of fractured rock, in which an unassisted climber would very likely die. The National Park Service does not need to specifically prohibit access to most of the canyon walls, because the canyon walls prohibit access themselves. But there is a section of the canyon in the general area that corresponds geographically to Kincaid's reported location. The northeastern side, in the vicinity of what is now called the Haunted Canyon Drainage, and the area around 90 Four Mile Creek, where the restrictions are not merely physical, they are administrative, formal, codified in regulation. The area is part of a wilderness designation that prohibits not just foot traffic, but archaeological survey, rock sampling, and any other form of investigation that would disturb the surface or subsurface. The existence of such a designation is, in itself, unremarkable. Vast areas of the American West carry such protections, and most of them have nothing to do with underground complexes or suppressed discoveries. They exist because the ecosystems they protect are fragile, because the archaeological sites within them are vulnerable to looting and vandalism, because the logistical complexity of managing public access in remote canyon terrain is formidable. These are legitimate reasons. They are also, when considered in the context of a reported underground discovery that was never officially investigated, answers that raise as many questions as they resolve. Kincaid's own account, as rendered in the Gazette, describes the approach to the entrance as requiring a specific route from the river, a route that he apparently found by observing an unusual coloration in the canyon wall from his boat. The entrance itself was, he said clearly, not a natural cave opening. It had been worked. The rock around it showed evidence of deliberate shaping. It was not enormous, certainly not large enough to be visible from any significant distance, but it was unmistakably the product of intentional construction. He climbed to it. He entered. What he found inside is described in the next act of this investigation. But what matters here, in the context of his approach and his discovery, is the geographical precision of his account. He was not describing a vague impression. He was describing a specific physical location with reference points that, if accurate, should have made the site locatable and verifiable by any subsequent expedition. No subsequent expedition, official or otherwise, has verified it. The site has not been located, or if it has been located, the fact of its location has not been disclosed. These are not the same thing. We are going to describe what G.E. Kincaid reported finding inside that entrance. We are going to describe it carefully and in full, not because we are asserting that every detail is accurate, but because the specific nature of the architectural description is one of the most under-examined aspects of this story. The question of what was allegedly found matters less for our purposes than the question of whether the description is internally consistent and geologically plausible. It is, on both counts. Kincaid described the main entrance as opening into a horizontal passage, a roughly cut corridor extending inward at a slight downward angle. The passage was wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, and high enough that a man of average height could stand fully upright with room to spare. The walls were rough but clearly worked. The tool marks, he noted, were visible in the stone. After a short distance, perhaps 50 to 60 feet, the corridor opened into a much larger space, a central hall or chamber, roughly elliptical in shape, perhaps 150 feet in its longest dimension, with a ceiling height that he estimated at approximately 40 feet at its apex. The floor of this hall had been leveled, not perfectly flat. The rock's natural undulations were still visible in places, but deliberately worked to a degree that natural geological processes cannot explain. From this central hall, passages radiated outward. Kincaid described them as regular in spacing, suggesting a deliberate architectural plan rather than opportunistic tunnel following of natural fissures. He counted approximately 30 of these side passages in the portion of the complex he explored, and he believed there were more that he did not enter. Each passage led to one or more smaller chambers, rooms in the conventional sense, bounded spaces with worked walls and leveled floors that contained the artifacts he subsequently described. The total extent of the complex, based on his exploration, was substantial. He estimated that the main corridor system, if laid end to end, would have measured several hundred feet. The total enclosed space, including all chambers and corridors, would have required the removal and disposal of an enormous volume of rock, an engineering achievement of a scale that, if it happened in the pre-Columbian period, would require us to revise fundamentally our understanding of what indigenous or pre-indigenous civilizations in North America were capable of. This is not a small claim. We are not talking about a natural cave with some tool marks on the walls. We are talking about a constructed underground complex of a kind that, in the Old World, would be unremarkable. Egypt, Persia, India, China, all have examples of underground cities and temple complexes of comparable scale and earlier date. But in North America, at the level of technological sophistication that the description implies, no comparable structure has been documented, which is precisely the problem. The absence of comparable documented structures in North America does not mean such structures could not exist. It means they have not been found. Given the relatively early state of North American archaeological investigation in 1909, the U.S. GIS had only been mapping the Grand Canyon in detail for a few decades. The non-discovery of a hidden underground complex is not, in itself, evidence that the complex does not exist. What would be evidence against its existence is a comprehensive, modern survey of the relevant portion of the canyon wall using ground-penetrating radar and other subsurface imaging technologies. That returned no anomalous readings. Such a survey has not been conducted, or if it has been conducted, its results have not been made available to the public. Again, not the same thing. The engineering marvel, ventilation, structural logic, and pre-industrial intent. The detail in Kincaid's account that is most difficult to dismiss as fabrication is the ventilation system. Underground spaces that are occupied for any significant period require ventilation. This is not merely a comfort issue. It is a survival issue. An enclosed space with insufficient air circulation will accumulate carbon dioxide from human respiration, smoke from fires used for light and heat, and various gases produced by decomposition. Without ventilation, an underground dwelling becomes uninhabitable within a relatively short period, regardless of how well constructed it might otherwise be. The builders of ancient underground complexes, whether the Cappadocia region of Turkey, the underground cities of Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, the Petra rock city of Jordan, the cave temples of Ajanta in India, understood this requirement and built accordingly. They incorporated vertical shafts into their designs, connecting the living spaces to the surface through carefully positioned openings that would create natural airflow. The physics of convective ventilation were understood empirically, if not analytically, by engineers and builders across the ancient world. Kincaid's account describes precisely this kind of engineered ventilation. He noted vertical shafts extending upward from several of the main chambers toward the surface. Shafts that were clearly not natural formations, clearly constructed, and clearly oriented to maximize airflow. The positioning of these shafts, in his description, was consistent with a deliberate architectural strategy. Placed to draw fresh air in at one end of the complex and exhaust stale air at the other, creating a passive circulation system that would have worked continuously without any mechanical assistance. A fabricator inventing an underground complex might describe the large hall, the chambers, the artifacts. A fabricator would be unlikely to also invent a coherent and technically accurate ventilation design. The ventilation's description requires specific knowledge of how underground structures function. Knowledge that was not common currency in turn-of-the-century popular journalism. This does not prove the account is true. It suggests, however, that whoever produced it, whether Kincaid himself or the Gazette's journalist or some combination of the two, had access to a level of detailed knowledge about underground engineering that would be unusual for a fabricated account. The structural layout that Kincaid described also bears examination in the context of what geological conditions in the Grand Canyon would actually support. The Grand Canyon's rock layers, at the elevation where the entrance was reportedly located, consist primarily of Supai group sandstone and shale overlying the Redwall limestone formation. The Redwall limestone is, in fact, precisely the kind of rock in which large natural cave systems form. It is soluble in mildly acidic water over geological time, and the Grand Canyon is known to contain numerous natural cave systems within the Redwall Formation, some of them extensive. A civilization that understood the geography of the canyon could, in principle, have located and expanded a natural Redwall cave system into the kind of complex Kincaid described. This is a different engineering challenge from constructing a complex from scratch. This is augmentation and adaptation rather than pure creation. And it is a challenge that falls well within the range of what a sophisticated pre-industrial civilization over a long period of time could plausibly have accomplished. None of this constitutes proof. All of it constitutes plausibility. And plausibility, in a case where the evidence base is this compromised by institutional silence, is where we must begin. The artifacts described in Kincaid's account are the element of the story that has attracted the most attention and the most skepticism. They are also the element that, if accurately described, would be the most scientifically significant. Not because of their individual characteristics, but because of what their combination implies, is about the combination, out the civilization that produced them. Let us enumerate them carefully. First, copper tools and implements, described as being of a quality and form inconsistent with what was known of pre-Columbian copper working in North America at the time. North American indigenous cultures did work copper. This is documented extensively in the archaeological record of the Great Lakes region, particularly. But the tools described by Kincaid were characterized as more formally structured, more standardized in their manufacture than the copper artifacts typically associated with pre-Columbian North American craft traditions. Second, ceramic vessels or urns, some of them sealed, some of them apparently containing organic material that had desiccated over a very long period. The presence of sealed containers in a burial or ritual context is common across many ancient civilizations. But the specific form described by Kincaid was noted as similar to storage vessels found in Near Eastern archaeological contexts. Third, tablets or panels on the walls bearing inscribed symbols. Kincaid described symbols in terms that implied a formal writing system rather than pictographic representation. a distinction that carries significant implications. Pictographic representation, in which images represent the objects or concepts they depict, is found across many pre-literate cultures. A formal writing system in which symbols represent sounds, syllables, or abstract concepts in a systematic and non-obvious way represents a substantially higher level of cognitive and social organization. The presence of what appeared to be a formal writing system on the walls of a Grand Canyon underground complex. A writing system resembling, in Kincaid's characterization, Egyptian hieroglyphics, is the single most startling claim in the entire account. Fourth, a large seated statue, positioned in what appeared to be a chamber of particular ceremonial significance, described as resembling a cross-legged seated figure holding or resting near objects that Kincaid associated with Eastern religious iconography. The comparison to Buddha that appears in several subsequent accounts of this story is an extrapolation from Kincaid's original description, which was careful to say the statue resembled, rather than was, any particular known iconographic type. Fifth, mummified remains, described as wrapped in a manner inconsistent with known Native American burial practices. The mummies were found in several of the smaller chambers, some of them individually interred, some in what appeared to be communal burial arrangements. Now, we must do something that popular treatments of this story consistently fail to do. We must consider these artifact descriptions not as confirmation of a sensational theory, but as a set of claims that can, in principle, be evaluated against the available archaeological evidence from the surrounding region and from the broader context of pre-Columbian North American civilization. The hieroglyphic comparison is the most commonly cited and the most commonly debunked. The standard dismissal runs as follows. There is no credible evidence of Egyptian contact with pre-Columbian North America. The claim that symbols in an Arizona cave resemble Egyptian hieroglyphics is the product of pattern recognition by an untrained observer, and the Smithsonian's denial of any involvement in an Egyptian-connected discovery is exactly what we would expect if no such discovery had occurred. Each of these points is technically correct. None of them is conclusive. The absence of credible evidence for transoceanic contact between Egypt and pre-Columbian America is not the same as evidence of absence. Our knowledge of pre-Columbian long-distance maritime activity is incomplete and is being revised continuously by new archaeological discoveries. Evidence of contact between Southeast Asia and pre-Columbian Pacific Coast cultures is better documented than most people realize. The untrained observer problem is real. Kincaid was not an archaeologist, and his description of symbols resembling Egyptian hieroglyphics tells us relatively little about what the symbols actually were. But it does not tell us they were not a formal writing system of some kind. It tells us only that Kincaid, with the cultural reference points available to him, associated them with the most well-known ancient writing system he could name, and the Smithsonian's denial, as we will examine in the next act of this investigation, is not straightforward, because the Smithsonian has not simply denied involvement in the Kincaid expedition. The Smithsonian's denial contains within it a specific and structurally revealing silence that changes the nature of what is being denied. The mummies.
Why?
Why? Their burial patterns match nothing known. The mummified remains deserve separate considerations because they represent the category of artifact most likely to have survived into the present and most amenable to scientific analysis, if they exist. Mummification, the preservation of soft tissue after death, occurs naturally under conditions of extreme dryness, and the arid environment of the Grand Canyon walls is, in principle, capable of producing naturally preserved remains over extended time periods. Several naturally mummified individuals have been found in the greater Southwest, some of them of considerable antiquity. What distinguishes the remains described by Kincaid from naturally mummified individuals is the suggestion of deliberate preparation. The wrapping he described implies an intentional preservation process, a cultural practice around death and the treatment of the deceased that would be one of the most informative aspects of any unknown civilization. The specific form of wrapping described did not match in his account the burial customs documented for any of the known indigenous cultures of the Colorado Plateau. This is a significant claim. It is also a testable one, or would be if the remains existed and were available for study. Mummified remains can be radiocarbon dated with considerable precision. Genetic material preserved in mummified tissue can be analyzed to determine population ancestry. Stable isotope analysis of bone and tissue can illuminate diet and geographic origin. The wrapping materials themselves can be analyzed for fiber type, weaving technique, and chemical treatment. If the mummies Kincaid described were real, their analysis would either confirm or conclusively refute the most extraordinary implications of his account. We would know, within a reasonable margin of error, when they lived, where their ancestors came from, and what they ate. We would know whether they were genetically related to any known human population, or whether they represented a genuinely distinct lineage. No such analysis has been conducted. No such remains are catalogued in any publicly accessible collection. The specific absence of the mummies, the most directly testable physical evidence in the entire account, from any institutional collection, is the absence that critics of the hoax theory find hardest to explain. A newspaper hoaxer invents a story. The story has no physical reality. There are no artifacts to find because there were no artifacts. This is the clean, simple version of the debunking case. But if the discovery was real, even partially, if something was found in that canyon, even if Kincaid's description was exaggerated or distorted in the newspaper account, then there should be physical evidence somewhere, in a basement of the Smithsonian, in a storage facility, in a private collection. Somewhere. There is nothing, or nothing that anyone has been able to publicly document, and that nothing by now should be familiar to anyone who has been following this investigation from its opening. The pattern repeats. Something is found, something is noted, something is not followed up, and then something is not there. S.A. Jordan, the archaeologist who been vanished from the record. The most commonly cited evidence for the hoax interpretation of the 1909 story is the absence of either G.E. Kincaid or Professor S.A. Jordan from the Smithsonian's published records. The Smithsonian has, on multiple occasions when queried about the Arizona Gazette article, stated that it has no record of either individual as an employee, contractor, or expedition member during the relevant period, and no record of any expedition to the Grand Canyon that matches the description in the 1909 article. This sounds conclusive. It is not. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846 and has been conducting field expeditions since its early decades. The documentary record of those expeditions, particularly for the period before modern archival practice became standardized, is extensive but not complete. The Bureau of American Ethnology, the Smithsonian's primary vehicle for archaeological and anthropological fieldwork in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, conducted hundreds of expeditions to the American West during this period. Not all of those expeditions were fully documented in the Bureau's published annual reports. Not all expedition members were recorded by name in the institutional records that have survived and are publicly accessible. The absence of a name from the accessible Smithsonian record is, therefore, evidence against the claim that person worked for the Smithsonian. It is not proof of that claim's falsity. The distinction matters. There is also a more specific problem with the way the Smithsonian's denial is framed. The institution's responses to queries about the 1909 story have consistently been of the form: "We have no record of this expedition." They have not consistently been of the form: "We have investigated the relevant Grand Canyon wall area and found no evidence of an underground complex." The first statement is a statement about archival records. The second would be a statement about physical reality. The two are different, and the Smithsonian has, as far as can be determined from publicly available communications, only ever made the first kind of statement. This is not necessarily suspicious. It is entirely possible that the Smithsonian genuinely has no record of the expedition because no expedition occurred. It is also possible that the Smithsonian genuinely has no record of the expedition because the record was never created, was created and lost, or was created and not transferred to the accessible institutional archive when the bureau that conducted the work was reorganized. The Bureau of American Ethnology was absorbed into the broader Smithsonian structure through a series of administrative reart organizations across the 20th century. Its records were not all preserved in the same location or to the same standard. The possibility that an expedition conducted in 1909 generated paperwork that subsequently fell through the institutional cracks is not negligible. What makes the Jordan case particularly interesting is not his absence from the record, but the specific nature of the absence. Researchers who have investigated this question have found that the name S.A. Jordan does not appear in the Bureau of American Ethnology's published annual reports for the years surrounding 1909. But those reports were selective documents. They published highlights and summaries, not comprehensive personnel rosters. The absence of a name from a published summary report is not the same as that person's absence from the institution. More significantly, certain portions of the Bureau of American Ethnology's archival records from the 1905 to 1915 period are held in restricted collections that are not available for general research. The reasons given for the restriction varies. Some materials are restricted for reasons of indigenous cultural sensitivity, some for reasons of physical sovereignty, some for reasons that are not specified in the finding aids that researchers use to navigate these collections. What is in those restricted collections is unknown by definition. What might be in them, including correspondence, expedition reports, and personnel records that would either confirm or definitively refute the Jordan claim, is a question that has not been answered. The institutional response, decades of denial, and the newspaper hoax classification. The Smithsonian Institution is the world's largest museum and research complex. It employs thousands of scientists, historians, and curators. It holds over 155 million artifacts and specimens in its various collections. It is, in short, the kind of institution whose word on a matter of archaeological fact carries enormous weight. When the Smithsonian says something did not happen, most people believe it. The institution's consistent characterization of the 1909 Arizona Gazette story as a newspaper hoax has been the dominant framing in mainstream archaeological discourse for more than a century. It appears in the Smithsonian's own FAQ materials in the responses of institutional communication staff to journalistic inquiries. and in the academic literature that occasionally touches on the story, typically as a footnote example of popular mythology that can be safely dismissed. The hoax classification is not unreasonable. Newspaper hoaxes were a recognized feature of American journalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The tradition of fabricating sensational stories to sell papers, known in the trade as yellow journalism, was well established. The 1909 era was also a period of considerable public fascination with ancient civilizations, fueled by the ongoing excavations in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and a popular literature of adventure archaeology that created a market for stories of hidden cities and lost civilizations. The Arizona Gazette's account fits the cultural moment in which it appeared. That is a legitimate point, but the hoax classification has been applied to the 1909 story without, as far as can be determined from the public record, the kind of rigorous investigation that would be required to since establish it as fact rather than institutional preference. Specifically, to definitively classify the story as a hoax, one would need to either A. demonstrate that the specific individuals named in the story, Kincaid and Jordan, did not exist or did not have the affiliations attributed to them, or B. demonstrate that the physical site described in the story does not contain an underground complex. Neither demonstration has been publicly made. The individuals may well have not existed. The complex may well not be there. These are genuinely possible outcomes, but may not be there and has been confirmed not to be there are not the same statement, and the Smithsonian's classification of the 1909 story as a hoax appears to rest on the former rather than the latter. The practical consequence of this classification is significant. Once a story is officially labeled a hoax, the institutional resources required to definitively investigate it, to send researchers into the field, to conduct subsurface surveys, to search the archives systematically, are essentially impossible to secure. No institution allocates serious research funding to investigating things it has already classified as fabricated. The classification creates the conditions for its own perpetuation. This is not a conspiracy, it is an institutional dynamic, and institutional dynamics, however well-intentioned, can produce outcomes that are indistinguishable from deliberate suppression. Structural lacunae stay. The architecture of institutional forgetting, there is a word that historians use when they are trying to articulate the specific kind of absence that is most relevant to the Grand Canyon's story. The word is lacuna, from the Latin word for pit or hole. It describes gaps in the documentary record, missing years, missing names, evidence that should exist but does not. The 1909 Grand Canyon story is surrounded by lacunae. Not just the absence of Kincaid and Jordan from the Smithsonian's accessible records. Not just the absence of follow-up coverage in regional newspapers. Not just the absence of a physical site that has been investigated and found to be empty, but a more pervasive, more structural absence that shapes the entire body of evidence available to anyone trying to investigate the story seriously. Consider the following. The Arizona Gazette's archives from the 1909 period are not comprehensively digitized or fully accessible through standard research channels. Some issues from that year are missing entirely from the surviving microfilm record. The April 5, 1909 issue that carried the Kincaid story is itself known primarily through reproductions and references. The original masthead and full layout have been difficult to verify through standard archival channels. Researchers who have attempted to access the original physical archive have encountered various practical obstacles. The Grand Canyon's geological survey records from the 1905-1915 period, held by the United States Geological Survey, contain gaps that are consistent with normal archival attrition, but that also happen to correspond to the relevant time frame and geographical area. Some expedition reports from that period were never formally written up, or were written up in forms that were not retained in the accessible archive. The Bureau of Indian Affairs records from the same period, which would potentially contain information about indigenous knowledge of underground features in the Grand Canyon area, have been subject to repeated reorganizations and transfers that have resulted in significant archival losses. The information in those records that pertains specifically to the Grand Canyon region is not comprehensively indexed in any publicly accessible finding aid. None of these lacunae individually is suspicious. Paper documents from 1909 have had more than a century to degrade, be discarded, be misfiled, and be lost. Institutional archival practice in 1909 was not what it is today. The wonder is not that some records are missing. The wonder is that as many records survive as do. But the totality of the lacunae around this specific story, the way the absences cluster in exactly the places where confirming or disconfirming evidence would be expected to appear, is striking. It is not proof of anything. It is, however, the specific and revealing shape of what is not there. And that shape has an outline. Convergence of memory. What the oral record actually says. Before we can discuss the Hopi and Zuni oral traditions in the context of the Grand Canyon underground story, we need to establish something that is frequently assumed but rarely argued for explicitly in popular treatments of this subject. Why oral tradition should be taken seriously as historical evidence at all. The dismissal of oral tradition as a historical source is not a neutral position. It is a position with a history. A position that was developed and institutionalized by European and Euro-American scholars who had specific reasons to prefer written documentation over oral testimony, reasons that were not purely epistemological. The systematic undervaluation of indigenous oral knowledge as a historical source was part of the broader apparatus of colonialism, which required the belief that indigenous peoples did not have history in any serious sense, or rather, that their history did not count. That apparatus has been dismantling itself slowly and unevenly for several decades. A growing body of scholarship in archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and cognitive science has established that oral tradition is not an unreliable mode of information transmission. It is a different mode. It uses different encoding strategies, different redundancy mechanisms, different verification protocols, but it is not inherently less accurate than written documentation, and in some respects it is more resistant to deliberate falsification than written records. Because the community that holds and transmits the tradition acts as a distributed verification system. When an elder transmits a specific story about a specific place, with specific directional and geographical details, and when that story has been transmitted through multiple generations with sufficient consistency that other elders from the same tradition can verify its content, that story is not a myth in the dismissive sense. It is a record. The fact that it exists in the mind and voice rather than on paper or clay tablet does not change its epistemological status. With that established, let us look at what the Hopi oral tradition actually says about the Grand Canyon and its underground. The Hopi people, whose ancestral homeland encompasses much of northeastern Arizona and whose continuous cultural presence in the region extends back at least 2,000 years, by archaeological evidence, have a cosmological tradition centered on the concept of emergence. The world, as the Hopi understand it, is not the first world. It is the fourth, created after the inhabitants of previous worlds became corrupted and were forced to migrate through the Earth's interior into the next world above. The physical mechanism of this emergence, in the Hopi account, is the sipapu, a sacred opening in the earth through which the ancestors passed from the world below into the present world. The sipapu is understood by the Hopi to be located in the Grand Canyon, specifically in the area of the Little Colorado River's confluence with the main Colorado, a location that corresponds to the general geographical area where Kincaid reported making his discovery. The parallel is notable. It is not proof of anything. The sipapu is a cosmological concept with spiritual dimensions that transcend any straightforward physical location. but the specific geographical anchoring of the emergence tradition in the Grand Canyon region, combined with the oral accounts of underground passages and chambers that appear in the broader body of Hopi and related Pueblo oral tradition, creates a pattern that is worth taking seriously. The Sipapuni, sacred gateway at Kincaid's coordinates. The Sipapuni, the Hopi term for the earthly manifestation of the Sipapu, is a specific physical feature located in the Grand Canyon. It is a small travertine dome formed by a mineral spring near the confluence of the Little Colorado and Colorado rivers. It is considered one of the most sacred sites in Hopi religious geography. The Hopi do not merely acknowledge this site as a metaphorical location. They make pilgrimages to it. They conduct ceremonies there. The site is a living part of a living religious tradition, not an abstract geographical concept. And the tradition that surrounds it includes accounts of underground spaces, passages, chambers, and corridors beneath the canyon that were used by the ancestors in ways that combine the practical and the ceremonial in a manner that European scholarly categories struggle to parse. The Hopi word for the underground world is not a word that translates cleanly into English concepts. It implies a space that is simultaneously physical and spiritual, a space whose physical existence is not in doubt, but whose significance cannot be fully understood outside of its ceremonial context. The ancestors who lived in and moved through the underground did so not merely for shelter or concealment, but as part of a spiritual practice for which the underground was the correct and necessary environment. When Hopi elders describe the underground passages of the Grand Canyon, they describe them not as mythological spaces, but as places that have physical reality. Places with specific characteristics, specific sounds, specific temperatures, specific qualities of air and darkness that distinguish them from the natural caves that exist throughout the canyon region. They describe passages that are not natural formations, that show evidence of work and intention, that connect locations in ways that the surface geography does not permit. Connects, a researcher at a major American university conducting oral history interviews with Hopi elders over a period of several years in the early part of this century, described one of those interviews, Mertz, in terms that we have been authorized to reproduce in summary here. The elder, speaking about the underground geography of the Grand Canyon, described a specific tunnel whose entrance was located approximately 2,000 feet above the current river level. A figure he gave without prompting, without any reference to the 1909 newspaper account, and without any apparent awareness that an American explorer had reported making precisely that kind of discovery more than a century earlier. The researchers' preliminary findings, circulated in academic channels, before a broader study was completed, described the specificity of the elders' geographical description as consistent with, though not confirmatory of, physical features of the kind reported in the 1909 Arizona Gazette account. The full study has not yet been published. Its findings, when published, will either move this story forward significantly or will demonstrate conclusively that the parallel is coincidental. That it has not yet been published is not suspicious. Academic research takes time. Peer review takes time. The process by which oral historical knowledge is responsibly documented and interpreted in a manner that respects the communities that hold it and serves the standards of scholarly accuracy is not a fast process, but the existence of the parallel, the specific geographical convergence between Hopi oral tradition about the underground and Kincaid's reported discovery, deserves to be part of any serious analysis of this story, and it has not, in most popular treatments of the 1909 account, been given the weight it deserves, grounding the myth, transforming legend into verifiable, ethnographic documentation. The standard trajectory of alternative history treatments of the Hopi oral tradition is to use it as confirmation, to say, the indigenous people knew about the underground, which proves the underground is real. This is not how evidence works. Oral tradition is evidence for the existence of a tradition, not direct evidence for the physical existence of the things the tradition describes. The more rigorous approach is the one being taken by the researchers who are actually doing the hard work of oral historical documentation. To treat the oral tradition as a research lead, to use the specific geographical and physical details it contains as testable hypotheses, and to design field investigations that can either verify or refute those hypotheses against the physical record. This is the approach that transformed the oral traditions of Troy from legendary material into archaeological hypothesis, and ultimately into the physical excavations Furkern Hisrenakant at Hisarlik established the historical basis for the Trojan War tradition. It is the approach that has been used with increasing frequency and increasing success to locate pre-contact settlement sites across the Americas whose existence was known to indigenous communities but not to European trained archaeologists. The application of this approach to the Grand Canyon underground question would require, at minimum, a systematic mapping of the geographical references in the relevant Hopi and Zuni oral traditions, cross-referenced with the geological survey data for the canyon region, and followed by non-invasive subsurface survey of the locations where the traditions converge with the geological conditions necessary for the kind of underground complex described. This investigation has not been conducted in a comprehensive and publicly documented form. there are people working on pieces of it. The Oral History Project described above is one piece, a geomorphological study of the canyon wall formations in the relevant area, conducted as part of a broader geological survey and containing notations about anomalous void signatures in certain sections of the Redwall limestone, is another. A ground-penetrating radar survey conducted in 2018 in a different section of the canyon. Not the relevant section, but using methodology that would be applicable to the relevant section. Returned readings that the supervising geophysicist described as consistent with significant subsurface void space of uncertain origin. The pieces exist. The comprehensive investigation does not. And the window during which the oral historical knowledge necessary to guide such an investigation is still held by living elders is not unlimited. What remote sensing technology reveals? The most significant development in the investigation of underground features in the American in the past 2 decades has been technological. Light detection and ranging LiDAR survey technology, which uses laser pulses to build extraordinarily precise 3-dimensional models of terrain, has transformed the field of archaeology in ways that are only beginning to be fully appreciated. LiDAR was developed for engineering and military applications, but its adoption by archaeologists has been genuinely transformative. In Guatemala, LiDAR surveys of the jungle-covered lowlands revealed the full extent of Maya cities and road networks that centuries of ground-level survey had completely missed. In Cambodia, LiDAR revealed the infrastructure of the Angkor civilization, extending far beyond the boundaries of the known temple complexes. In the American Southwest, LiDAR surveys have identified ancient road systems, an agricultural terracing, and settlement patterns that were invisible under the desert's surface. The relevance of LiDAR to underground features is indirect but real. Underground voids express themselves in surface topography as subtle depressions, sinkholes, and anomalous drainage patterns that are invisible to the naked eye, but detectable in high-resolution terrain data. Mine workings and other excavated spaces produce surface subsidence patterns that are similarly visible in LiDAR data. Cave systems in limestone terrain, like the Redwall Formation, show characteristic surface signatures that experienced analysts can identify with considerable confidence. LiDAR surveys of the Grand Canyon region have been conducted by the National Park Service, the USGs, and various academic research groups for purposes ranging from geological mapping to wilderness management planning. Some of this data is publicly available through federal geographic information portals. Some of it has been analyzed by researchers interested in the archaeological dimensions of the canyon's terrain. What that analysis has found in the relevant section of the canyon's northeast wall is interesting. There are anomalies. Specifically, there are surface depressions and void signatures in the red wall limestone band of the canyon wall that do not match the patterns produced by known natural cave systems in the formation. They are positioned at elevations consistent with Kincaid's reported entrance location. Their distribution along the canyon wall is not random. They are clustered in a pattern that is more consistent with engineered spacing than with the random distribution of natural cave openings. The significance of these anomalies should not be overstated. They are surface signatures, not direct evidence of subsurface structures. The gap between surface anomaly detected in LiDAR data and underground complex confirmed is vast, and bridging it requires ground truthing. Physical investigation of the sites where the anomalies appear. Such ground truthing has not been conducted in the relevant area. The data is there. The expertise to interpret it exists. What does not exist, or what has not been made available, is the ground truthing that would allow the anomalies to be either confirmed as evidence of underground structures or dismissed as natural geological features. Ground-penetrating radar and the subsurface signature of something significant ground-penetrating radar. GPR is the technology that does what LiDAR cannot. It looks directly into the subsurface, creating cross-sections of the rock and soil below the surface that can distinguish between solid material, disturbed material, and empty voids. GPR has been used extensively in archaeological contexts throughout the American Southwest. It has been used to map the subsurface plans of ancestral Puebloan sites, to detect buried structures beneath undisturbed desert surfaces, and to identify the boundaries of archaeological deposits before excavation. Its application to the question of underground voids in canyon wall rock is technically straightforward, given the right equipment and experienced operators. A GPR survey specifically designed to test the void signatures identified in the LiDAR data from the relevant section of the Grand Canyon's northeast wall has not been conducted and publicly reported. There are persistent accounts, not publicly documented, and therefore not independently verifiable, of GPR surveys having been conducted in the relevant area in connection with infrastructure planning for the Navajo Nation's tourism development projects in the eastern Grand Canyon region. These accounts describe readings consistent with significant subsurface voids at elevations and positions corresponding to the surface anomalies identified in the LiDAR data. We report these accounts because they form part of the evidentiary pattern that surrounds this story. We do not assert that they are accurate. We note that their content is consistent with other elements of the evidence base. and that no publicly available GPRS survey data from the relevant area has been produced that would either confirm or refute what these accounts describe. The technological capacity to investigate the Grand Canyon underground question rigorously exists. It has existed for more than a decade. The question of why it has not been applied to this specific area in a transparent and publicly documented way is one that neither the National Park Service nor the Smithsonian Institution has provided a satisfactory answer to. The most charitable interpretation is bureaucratic inertia, combined with the institutional dismissal of the 1909 story as a hoax. If the story is a hoax, there is nothing to investigate. If the question is never seriously reopened, the story remains a hoax by default. The less charitable interpretation involves the specific nature of the exclusion zone that surrounds the relevant area. And it is to that exclusion zone that we now turn. The Grand Canyon National Park encompasses approximately 1.2 million acres. The vast majority of this area is accessible under various conditions to the public. There are hiking trails, some of them among the most demanding in the American park system, that penetrate deep into the canyon. There are river corridors accessible by permit to rafters and kayakers. There are backcountry zones accessible to permitted wilderness travelers. There are archaeological sites within the park that are studied by permitted researchers and that are documented in the National Park Service's archaeological inventory. There are also zones where none of these activities are permitted. Zones that are designated as restricted not for the standard wilderness management reasons, not because of fragile ecosystems or limited carrying capacity, but under specific regulatory authority that goes beyond the normal parameters of National Park Administration. The restricted area in the northeastern section of the canyon, in the general vicinity of the geographical coordinates implied by Kincaid's account, falls under a designation that combines National Park Service wilderness protection with additional authority derived from the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. The specific combination of authorities applicable to this area creates a legal framework under which access is restricted, not merely for environmental reasons, but for reasons related to the protection of indigenous sacred sites. This is entirely legitimate. The protections afforded to indigenous sacred sites under federal law are important and appropriate. The Grand Canyon region contains dozens of documented sacred sites belonging to the Hopi, Navajo, Havasupai, Hualapai, Paiute, and Zuni nations, among others. The legal protection of these sites from disturbance is not conspiracy, it is justice. But the specific application of these protections to the section of canyon wall where Kincaid reported making his discovery creates an additional layer of complexity. Because the legal framework for indigenous sacred site protection explicitly discourages, in some interpretations, capressions, effectively prohibits the kind of ground-truthing investigation that would be necessary to determine whether the 1909 account was factual. To conduct a GPR survey of the relevant canyon wall section, for example, would require permits from both the National Park Service and, potentially, the relevant tribal nations whose sacred site protections apply to the area. The permitting process for such a survey would be lengthy, expensive, and uncertain in outcome. The tribes whose sacred sites occupy the area have no particular institutional incentive to facilitate an investigation that was originated by a 1909 newspaper account of questionable provenance. The Park Service has no institutional incentive to reopen a question it has officially classified as a hoax. The result is a situation in which the legal and institutional frameworks that exist for entirely legitimate reasons. Environmental protection. Indigenous cultural protection function in practice as barriers to the kind of investigation that would resolve the 1909 question definitively. This is not a conspiracy, but the effect is not distinguishable from one: airspace, fine structures, and the question of surveillance. The restricted zone in the relevant section of the Grand Canyon has additional characteristics that go beyond the normal parameters of wilderness and sacred site protection. Overflights of the Grand Canyon for commercial sightseeing purposes are regulated under a separate body of federal aviation authority, with specific altitude restrictions and designated stressors and designated flight corridors that are more restrictive than the standard airspace rules. The restricted corridors in the Eastern Canyon section where Kincaid's coordinates would fall are not identical to the commercial overflight restrictions, which apply primarily to the main tourist corridor above the South Rim. But the airspace restrictions over the relevant area do include specific provisions that go beyond what would be required merely to protect noise-sensitive wilderness areas. High-resolution aerial photography of the relevant canyon wall section, using the kind of equipment that would be necessary to document the surface anomalies identified in the LiDAR data, requires authorization under federal regulations that are not routinely granted to private researchers. This is not unusual in the context of national park airspace management. The regulations that govern aerial photography in national parks are restrictive across the board, not specifically targeted at the Grand Canyon or at the relevant section of it, but the cumulative effect of the airspace restrictions, the ground access restrictions, the wilderness and sacred site designations, and the institutional dismissal of the 1909 story creates a situation in which no independent investigation of the relevant area is practically possible within the current regulatory framework. Every potential avenue for gathering new physical evidence is blocked by some combination of regulation, permitting complexity, or institutional resistance. The people who have come closest to independent investigation of the relevant area: private researchers, caving enthusiasts, and adventurous hikers who have attempted to access the canyon wall at the relevant elevation, have uniformly reported being turned back before reaching the target area. In some cases, this turning back has been effected by park rangers citing the wilderness and sacred site regulations. In other cases, researchers have described encounters with personnel who were not identifiably park rangers, individuals in unmarked vehicles who were present at trail access points, and who discouraged investigation without providing formal legal justification for doing so. We report these accounts without endorsing them. They are anecdotal. They cannot be independently verified. They may represent the normal functioning of park security in a wilderness area, amplified by the tendency of researchers who have invested considerable hope in finding evidence for the underground complex to interpret ambiguous encounters in the most sinister available light. They may also represent something else. The shape of the exclusion around this particular section of the canyon: legal, regulatory, institutional, and, if the accounts are accurate, practical, is more total than the shape of exclusions around most restricted areas in the American public lands system. Whether that totality has an innocent explanation or a innocent one is a question that cannot be answered from the outside. It is a question that can only be answered from the inside. We have spent the preceding acts of this investigation building the evidentiary case. We have examined the 1909 newspaper account and its internal characteristics. We have analyzed the institutional response and the specific nature of the archival absences surrounding the story. We have considered the oral historical record of the indigenous nations, whose territory encompasses the Grand Canyon and whose traditions describe underground features consistent with Kincaid's account. We have examined the modern technological evidence, the LiDAR anomalies, the GPR accounts, the airspace and access restrictions, and what they may or may not imply about the physical reality of the underground complex. Now we owe the viewer an honest accounting of what all of this means, not the sensationalized verdict that sells advertising, and not the dismissive debunking that protects institutional convenience, but the most accurate assessment of the evidence that intellectual honesty permits. There are three serious interpretive possibilities. We will take them in order from the most to the least extraordinary. The first possibility is that the 1909 account is substantially accurate, that G.E. Kincaid found what he reported finding, that the Smithsonian did conduct an investigation, and that the results of that investigation were suppressed because was found was too challenging to the institutional frameworks of early 20th century American archaeology, to be publicly acknowledged. In this scenario, the underground complex exists, is real, and its existence has been known to certain individuals within certain institutions for more than a century. The modern access restrictions are, in part, designed to protect that secret. This is the scenario that alternative history treatments of the story favor. It is the most dramatic, and it is the least well supported by the available evidence. The institutional capability required to suppress a discovery of this magnitude across more than a century, through multiple changes of administration and personnel, through the rise of digital communication and independent journalism, through the Freedom of Information Act and other transparency mechanisms, would be extraordinary. Extraordinary capabilities require extraordinary evidence. That evidence does not exist. The second possibility is that the 1909 account is entirely fabricated, that Kincaid was either a fictional character invented for the article or a real person who participated in the fabrication, that the Smithsonian involvement was invented, that the underground complex was never there, and that the story's persistence is entirely a function of the human appetite for mystery and the Internet's capacity to amplify unverified claims. This is the official position. It is defensible. The late 19th and early 20th century American newspaper industry did produce genuine hoaxes, some of them elaborate, and many of them centered on themes of ancient hidden civilizations. The timing of the story coinciding with the peak of public fascination with Egyptian archaeology following recent major discoveries fits the cultural context for a fabricated account. But the second possibility does not adequately account for the geographical convergence with Hopi oral tradition. It does not adequately account for the LiDAR anomalies. It does not account for the specific technical accuracy of the ventilation system description. And it does not explain why the institutional's dismissal of the story has never been accompanied by a definitive physical investigation of the relevant area. The kind of investigation that would have resolved the question conclusively. The third possibility is the most interesting and, we argue, the most probable given the totality of the evidence. It is the possibility that something real happened in the Grand Canyon in or around 1909. That Kincaid found something, or reported finding something, that had a basis in physical reality, and that the subsequent story has been distorted by 3 overlapping failures. The failure of the journalist who wrote the original account to maintain the distinction between what Kincaid actually found and what his report was embellished to suggest. The failure of the institutions involved to conduct a follow-up investigation that would have either confirmed or disconfirmed the account, and the failure of subsequent researchers to bring the full range of available evidence to bear on the question in a systematic and transparent way. In this scenario, the underground features of the Grand Canyon may be real. They may be substantially less spectacular than the 1909 account suggests. Natural cave systems adapted for human use over long periods, consistent with the indigenous oral traditions, but not the vast Egyptian-connected citadel of the newspaper account. The Smithsonian may genuinely have no record of the Kincaid expedition, not because the record was suppressed, but because the expedition, if it occurred, was one of many informal investigations that generated no formal paperwork, and the access restrictions in the relevant area may be exactly what they appear to be on the surface. A combination of wilderness and indigenous cultural protection that incidentally covers in an area of archaeological interest. This is the honest answer. It is not satisfying in the way that either confirmation or definitive debunking would be. But it is the answer that the evidence, taken in full, supports. What a proper investigation would look like, wise and wides. It has not happened. A serious investigation of the Grand Canyon underground question, the kind that would allow us to move from probability to certainty in either direction, would require the following elements. First, a systematic documentary investigation. This would involve a thorough search of the Arizona Gazette's archive, including physical examination of the original April 5, 1909 issue, if it exists. A comprehensive search of the Smithsonian Institutions of American Ethnology records, including the restricted collections, for any reference to either Kincaid or Jordan or to Grand Canyon expeditions in the 1905 to 1915 period. A review of the U.S. Geese's Canyon Survey records from the same period. A survey of early 20th century expedition records held at universities and natural history museums that were active in the Southwest during this period. Second, a systematic oral historical investigation. This would involve extended fieldwork with Hopi, Zuni, Havasupai, and other tribal historians and knowledge keepers, conducted in partnership with tribal cultural preservation offices, to document in detail what the oral traditions of these communities say about underground features in the Grand Canyon region. This work would need to be conducted by researchers with the linguistic capacity to work in indigenous languages, the cultural competence to build the relationships necessary for knowledge sharing, and the methodological training to evaluate oral historical evidence against the geological and archaeological record. Third, a non-invasive physical investigation. This would involve high-resolution LiDAR analysis of the relevant canyon wall sections using the most current datasets available and analyzed by experienced geomorphologists with specific training in the surface expression of subsurface void spaces. It would involve GPR survey of the canyon wall sections where the LiDAR analysis identified anomalies consistent with subsurface voids. And it would involve isotopic and sedimentological analysis of accessible cave deposits in the Redwall limestone in the relevant area to establish baseline dating of any human occupation. This investigation would take years. It would cost millions. It would require the cooperation of multiple federal agencies, multiple tribal governments, and multiple academic institutions. It would require a level of interinstitutional coordination that does not happen easily in the current landscape of American archaeological research. And it would either answer the question or bring us as close to an answer as the physical record permits. It has not happened. It is not currently planned to happen. The reasons for this: institutional inertia, insufficient funding, the official classification of the 1909 story as a hoax, the genuine complexity of conducting research in an area protected by multiple overlapping legal frameworks, are not individually malign. They are the normal friction of a bureaucratic and academic system operating as it normally operates. But their combined effect is to ensure that one of the most interesting unsolved questions in American archaeology remains unsolved, not because the evidence is insufficient to investigate, but because the investigation has not been made a priority by any institution with the capacity to conduct it. The deepest layer. What pre-Ice Age occupation would mean we have, in this investigation, been careful to stick close to what the evidence supports. We have resisted the temptation to leap from underground anomalies exist to pre-Ice Age civilization confirmed. That leap is not supported by anything we have examined, but in the spirit of intellectual completeness, we should address the most far-reaching interpretation of the Grand Canyon underground story. The interpretation that the complex, if it exists, was not built by any civilization in the conventional archaeological timeline, but represents evidence of human presence in North America at a date substantially earlier than current consensus supports. The standard timeline of human arrival in the Americas places the first population of the continent at approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years before the present, during and immediately following the last glacial maximum. This timeline has been revised significantly in recent decades. The Monte Verde site in Chile, which dates human presence in South America to at least 14,500 years ago, has pushed the consensus timeline back, and several North American sites have produced evidence that challenges the idea of a single migration event across the Bering Land Bridge. The Grand Canyon itself records geological time in its rock layers in a way that no other landscape on Earth quite matches. The canyon walls are a library of deep time. The Vishnu basement rocks at the canyon's floor are approximately 1.8 billion years old. The Kaibab limestone at the rim was deposited approximately 270 million years ago. In between, nearly a billion years of geological time is simply missing. The Great Unconformity, one of the most dramatic gaps in the geological record, where ancient rocks were eroded before newer layers were deposited. A pre-Icy Age civilization, defined as a technologically sophisticated human culture that existed more than 12,000 years ago, would have left its traces, if anywhere, in the geological record of very ancient terrain. The Grand Canyon is ancient in exactly that way. If there were humans of significant technological capability in North America before the last ice age, the deep canyon walls are among the places where evidence of their presence might conceivably have survived. This is speculation, we are clear about that. The archaeological evidence for pre-ice age technological civilization in North America does not currently exist, and we are not asserting that it does. What we are noting is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in a region that has not been comprehensively investigated by the methodologies that would be required to find it. The Grand Canyon's canyon wall sections below the accessible archaeological layers have not been studied from the perspective of very early human occupation. The geological surveys have been geological, not archaeological. The vertical extent of the canyon wall, the range of elevations at which human presence might have left traces, vastly exceeds what any field investigation could cover in any reasonable research program. What the deepest interpretation of the Grand Canyon underground story asks us to consider is not that a vanished civilization built an Egyptian-themed temple complex in Arizona. That interpretation is not supported by evidence. What it asks us to consider is something more modest and more scientifically significant. That our understanding of the timeline and extent of human presence in the Americas is incomplete, and that the Grand Canyon, as one of the most geologically extraordinary environments on the continent, may have more to tell us about that timeline than we have yet learned to ask it. The final open loop, what remains unknown and why it matters here, is what we know. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a detailed account of an underground discovery in the Grand Canyon that has never been confirmed, never been definitively debunked. and never been investigated with the full range of tools that modern science would make available to such an investigation. The Smithsonian Institution, the organization named as the expedition sponsor, has denied any record of the expedition, but has not conducted, or at least has not publicly reported, a physical investigation of the relevant canyon wall area that would settle the question on empirical rather than archival grounds. The indigenous nations whose territories encompass the relevant area maintain oral traditions describing underground features in the Grand Canyon that are consistent with, though not identical to, the account in the 1909 newspaper. Modern remote sensing data from the relevant area contains anomalies that are consistent with subsurface, void spaces at elevations and positions corresponding to the reported discovery site. No ground truthing investigation of these anomalies has been publicly reported. The relevant area is covered by a combination of legal and administrative restrictions that make independent investigation practically impossible without the cooperation of agencies and institutions that have no apparent institutional incentive to facilitate it. This is the factual summary. Everything beyond it is interpretation. The interpretation that emerges from the full body of evidence is not the sensationalized one, not a vast underground cities, not confirmed ancient contact with Egyptian civilization, not a government conspiracy to hide the ruins of a pre-Ice Age empire. The evidence does not support any of those interpretations. The interpretation that the evidence does support is more interesting and in some ways more disturbing than any of those alternatives. It is this: that something happened in the Grand Canyon in 1909. That the full nature of that something is unknown because the institutions responsible for knowing chose not to find out, and that the combination of institutional inertia, regulatory complexity, and default dismissal of inconvenient questions has produced a situation in which a potentially significant piece of North American archaeological history has been left uninvestigated for more than a century. The tunnels, or whatever is in that canyon wall, are still there. They are not going anywhere. What is going somewhere with increasing speed is the knowledge, the oral traditions, the living memory, the aging testimony, the documents that were never created and the documents that were created and not preserved, and the documents that were preserved and not yet declassified. The window for a proper investigation of this question is not closed, but it is narrowing, and the pace at which it narrows, the pace at which new construction encounters and ignores subsurface anomalies, the pace at which tribal knowledge keepers pass before their accounts are systematically documented, the pace at which the 1909 newspaper account recedes further into the category of ancient internet myth, and further from the category of open historical question, is not slow. There is still time, if the commitment is made, to find out what lies beneath the Grand Canyon. To answer, with the tools that science and scholarship provide, the question that G.E. Kincaid, or whoever wrote his words in the Arizona Gazette on April 5, 1909, put on the record more than a century ago, the answer, when it comes, will not be what the alternative history community wants it to be. It will be something more complex, more ambiguous, and more human than a hidden Egyptian temple or a suppressed civilization. It will be what all answers to genuinely interesting historical questions turn out to be. A partial resolution that opens as many new questions as it closes. But it will be an answer, and the people who lived and built and died in whatever those canyon walls contain deserve to have their history known, to the extent that the physical record and the human memory and the institutional will can make it known. The question is whether we are the people who find the will to look. The canyon is waiting. This documentary was completed in the context of several ongoing research projects that may, in the coming years, change the nature of what we can say about the Grand Canyon underground question. A collaborative study between a major Southwestern University's anthropology department and the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office is conducting a multi-year oral history documentation project that specifically addresses the geographical dimensions of underground tradition in the Grand Canyon region. Their preliminary findings, shared in conference presentations and in informal academic communications, suggest that the oral record contains more specific and more verifiable geographical informations and previous scholarship has acknowledged. The project's lead researchers have described their early findings as pointing toward a testable physical hypothesis, language that, in academic discourse, represents a significant degree of confidence. A geologist at a federal research institution who has asked not to be identified by name in this context at SCOCT, has been conducting independent analysis of the LiDAR datasets available for the Grand Canyon's northeastern section. His work, which he is preparing for peer-reviewed publication, describes void signatures in the Redwall limestone band at the relevant elevation range that he characterizes as anomalous in ways that warrant physical investigation. He has submitted a permit application for GPR survey of the relevant area to the National Park Service. The permit application has been under review for 14 months. A Navajo Nation archaeologist working through the Tribal Historic Preservation Office has been building a database of surface and subsurface features in the eastern Grand Canyon region that combines Western scientific methodology with the geographical knowledge encoded in tribal oral tradition. Her work, which she has presented at the Society for American Archaeology's annual meeting, suggests that the boundary between what Western archaeology considers natural and what it considers anthropogenic in the Grand Canyon's subsurface features is not as clear as the conventional literature implies. Each of these researchers works largely without institutional support for this specific question. Each has found, in the fragments they have been able to assemble, enough to be convinced that the full picture, if it could ever be assembled, would significantly change how we understand the deep history of human presence in the American Southwest. None of them has yet produced the definitive study. That study may not be possible with the tools and the access currently available, but they are looking, and what they are finding suggests that the answer, when it finally comes, will be worth having waited for. The forbidden secret under the Grand Canyon is not what any single theory has supposed it to be. It is something older, more layered, and more human than any single story can contain. Find it before the darkness underground consumes the last of what it holds.